So hello everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm welcoming you from a very hot London. Thank you for people wherever you are connecting from. I'm particularly grateful to the French speakers and those based in France, because today is a day of Bastille, so it's a big day for France, and so I'm very grateful to Basile in particular, and others also Thomas, because it's a big holiday, of course. So very briefly, I will introduce this event today. This is the CEPR competition policy RPN. This RPM is about 1 year old. We set it up, it was set up by Greg and Christina a year ago in order to be a platform, hopefully the key platform for a discussion, sometimes a critical discussion on competition policy and its interaction with academic world. And in fact, most of us are academics. Some of us have also a policy experience, and we had a feeling, a perception that sometimes research and policy are disconnected or are not connected enough. So we want to really try to join them as much as possible. I think, in fact, this is a very exciting period for IO and the competition policy, especially if you are prepared to have broader views and a broader influx of researchers from other fields. And today is going to be a case in point. Because competition policy deals with companies, and very often very rich companies, there is a very strict disclosure policy that we have in the RPN. Today is not particularly relevant because it's a private event, so it's not that people will be excited, etc. So we really want to have a frank discussion. But to stick to our disclosure policy, I have nothing to disclose apart from being the academic consultant of the CMA currently on one case in the UK. So that's my only disclosure. Now we move on to the second and part, which is in fact the main event on today, which is inflation and corporate greed. I'm sure you've seen lots of this discussion on social media. People have very strong views. Sometimes it's part of the reaction of academia that we are very parochial. So my view on this is that sometimes the macro people, they don't entertain the idea that there may be market power issues because their models typically do not account for heterogeneity in market power because it's hard. Instead, on IO, we gave up any macro ambitions because we look at very narrow things, and so we lost the bigger picture. And Andrea was saying sometimes that this is what is also in that case. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation today. We are not going to find a solution to a huge problem in our economies, but we have a very accomplished panelists from different fields in economics. I asked them to reflect on some questions about the causes of inflation, whether the underlying cause, of course, maybe some monetary expansive policy during fiscal policies during COVID, but maybe the effects that we observe may be related also to market structure issues. Is that possible? Can market power explain some of these spikes? And we're going to talk about whether our models are fit for purpose, both from the macro side and the IO side, and then solutions. Can solutions involve perhaps also tightening of competition policy or not? So these are the big questions. We will have a variety of views. As Luigi suggested, when you're going to make your remarks, perhaps you may want to tell whether you have in mind more the US or the Eurozone or the UK, because obviously these are very different economic areas. But I'll start with Luigi, the floor is yours. The idea, we've got an hour and for your remarks, or perhaps a couple of rounds of 5 minutes each. You can also react to each other, and people can also put questions in the chat, and there will be time at the end to ask questions directly. Thank you, Luigi.
Thank you, Tommaso. Can I share? I have a couple of slides, nothing major, and my preamble is I am probably the least competent of all this panel, so I will start. I think Tommaso correctly pointed me at the beginning for the big picture that is saying like very vague facts and nothing dramatic. So I will start with a little bit of my relatively uninformed view of what are the causes of the recent bout of inflation, which, as we all know, is the global phenomenon, but live very differently in different countries. So as you see, the UK and US as the top in the scale, But even in Switzerland and Japan, albeit starting from much lower level and going to much lower level, we see a significant increase in inflation. And I did something that is basically illegal to do because there are too few data, etc. But I wanted to divide among the major countries what was the inflation at the beginning of 2021, what was inflation at the end of 2021, and then the latest reading available, which reflects a lot of the oil shock due to the Ukrainian war. And what I at least can see is that the US and the UK are at the very top of what I call the policy shock, because the inflation rises very early on, way before the war, and this policy shock is present a little bit everywhere, but of course is much different. So Japan, you see the inflation going from minus 0.7 to 0.8, so not something to really worry about, versus in the United States goes from 1.4 to 7. And then you have the oil shock that is actually, not surprisingly, relatively small for the US, but very big for countries like Italy. In fact, Italy is the country where you see one of the largest shock for that. Now, when you think about the cause of inflation, there is only the embarrassment of the choice, because you had three major supply shocks: the pandemic, the supply chain disruption, and the oil shock. And even early on the pandemic, everybody was saying the pandemic will create a drop in demand, will not create inflation. I think part of it is that inflation was not measured properly because there was unavailability of stuff. So if you wanted to buy a Peloton in April 2020, you will have to wait forever, which is not measuring as inflation, because we're not good enough to import that, but in fact was inflation. And if you are trying to get safely into a restaurant, you have to pay a fortune. So basically, at the beginning of the pandemic, some stuff became unavailable and was not measured as inflation, but it was a supply shock, was inflation. And then of course, we had the supply chain shock from the ports to what happened in China, etc., and then the oil shock. And this at the same time as that we had an extremely expensive, and this is my value judgment, excessively expensive fiscal policy in most of the countries, and so the monetary policy. So I think that if we were to try to claim that market power is the main culprit of inflation, I think we would be kind of crazy, in my view. However, I think it could be an important concourse. So we see that there is a huge variation depending on the markets you consider. And most importantly, because the past is great, but we cannot change it, I think it could be an important obstacle in reducing inflation in the future. So I think that what our panel and our analysis in the future should focus on is more on number two and a little bit on number one. So I've seen this paper, I don't know if you've seen, that comes out of the, I think the Roosevelt Institute, where they replicate Ian work and they extended a bit in 2021. And what I would like to ask this expert of panel, because they're much more expert than I am, you see like a dramatic increase in 2021. Is this just an accident? Is this the result of some mechanical features, or is that real? And if this real, is it a proof of market power, or is simply that there are bottlenecks, and if you are Peloton and all of a sudden there is a long line for your product and you can't get material for more bicycles, so what you're going to do, you're going to increase prices. Is it because you have market power, or simply because there is a temporary shortage? Now, what is interesting in the study is that they look at the increase in markup distributed by the initial markup. And what they find is that the markup went up where was higher to begin with. So a kind of a Matthew effect in markups, which is interesting by itself, because if you think of it, there should be kind of an upper bound of how much you can mark up things, but it seems here that at least in this short period of time, you don't see that. And so I think that the question that I would like to sort of transfer to the panel is that how this rise is simply a direct effect of supply restrictions, and what kind of restrictions? Some might be exogenously given, like if you cannot import microchips from Taiwan, you cannot produce Tesla. This is not really anything that we in the short term can change in the United States. But there is another kind of supply restriction, is that restaurants are struggling to hire new workers. And as a reaction, they increase prices. Now, we know that there is a way to hire new workers, is increase wages. So this is more endogenous. They choose not to increase wages, but they prefer to increase prices. So the question is why that's the case. And two, that I've seen that did supply restriction make it easier to coordinate a price increase? If I am Ford and I know that GM has the same sort of issue with a microprocessor, I feel confident in raising prices and knowing I'm not going to lose a lot of market share, because they cannot flood the market with their products, and vice versa. So maybe you start with a very concentrated market, and then you add this shock, and this shock make it easier to coordinate, of course, tacitly collude, not explicitly, but tacitly collude to a higher rate increase. Or this increase in response to stimulus-induced demand that maybe, and we know that a lot of money, at least in the United States, a lot of money was transferred to families, and there are some interesting data coming from JP Morgan suggesting how much liquidity less wealthy income family tend to have today vis-a-vis any other situation in history. So one of the interesting questions is how they will respond to an increase in interest rates, because generally there was a direct channel, both in rates and availability of credit, that was jeopardizing purchases by lower income part of the distribution. Now they have a buffer, so maybe they don't respond to monetary policy the way they used it. And then what percentage of companies are simply passing through some cost? I think that what I will ask or invite people to do is more specific studies about who raises the prices more and why, and because this is interesting also to see how this would be undone. So if this is just a temporary effect, like the Peloton effect, we know that now you can buy Peloton online for a fraction of the cost because nobody wants them anymore. In fact, Peloton is in financial trouble. So that's a temporary phenomenon. But if we Ford and GM coordinated on a price increase, I think that this curve is going to stick. It's not going to go back up anytime soon, even if all of a sudden supply becomes more available. So with this, I think exhausted my time, and I let the rest of the panel talk.
Thank you, Luigi. A lot of questions. I'm sure that we're going to get back to some of them. But next, it's quite nice, since you mentioned the work of the Lurker, Eckhout, and Unger. So we got Jan. Who's going to tell us about markups, among other things. And perhaps you're going to tell us more about the why markups in 2021 seem to be particularly at the highest ever level. Jan.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tommaso, for having me on here. I think I'm going to follow up on much what Luigi has said. I should also say that I'm going to talk about inflation. You think here's a macro labor guy who's before been talking about IO, and now he's going to talk about inflation. So, you know, sometimes you might see things that you should rightly question. So first of all, is market power the same as corporate greed? I would like to open this for discussion. I'm going to say something more about this also in a bit. But let me start with some very basics. Okay, so if you think about inflation, inflation is about levels of prices, and if not all, but many of the measures that we have for market power, say markets or profit rates, are about ratios. And so you could have prices going up, so you could have markups going up while prices fall because your costs fall even further. I mean, if you think about semiconductors and Moore's law, the productivity of semiconductors has gone up a lot, so the cost goes down very sharply. So the price per unit over quality is going down, but you could still have increases in the markups. Then the second thing, so I think we have to make a distinction between levels and ratios here, and inflation is all about levels. Then the second thing is the time horizon. I think we should think of market power as a very slow-moving process. It's about huge investments. It's about firms making innovations in a way to create maybe some market power. And on the other side, inflation is very fast. I mean, if you think about the surgical masks market in March 2020, prices jumped from about 5 cents per mask to $1.50 in a very short period of time. And so I think we should compare really, the movement of markups and market power as an oil tanker and inflation, the way at least we've seen recently as a jumpy zodiac. It's something that changes in a very different time frame. The third thing is magnitudes. If you look at inflation, we're now talking about 9% per year, as Luigi showed. Markups we've seen going up at most 1% on average per year. Now, there's of course a lot of heterogeneity across firms, but that's also true with inflation. There's a distribution of inflation. And so magnitudes are very different. And so basically the last basic fact is that if a central bank has the right tools and pursues the right policies and is credible, then basically there will, in the long run, be no inflation larger than 2%. And so if we think about models, and I'm going to come back to models in a second, but if we think about how we typically model inflation, this is coming from the fact that agents in the economy cannot adjust their prices instantaneously. So basically, unless you have a Calvo price adjustment probability that goes to zero, so firms or households cannot adjust their prices instantaneously, then that's the only way in which you can have inflation in the long run. And so now there's of course a big caveat to that. Are the central banks doing the right thing? Is the Taylor rule the right rule that they're using? Then in addition to these basics, what are the effects on corporate greed or on markups? I'm going to basically complement much of what Luigi said here. But first of all, firms increase their prices mainly because they can. Now, the question is, what is the reason why they're doing it? And so what we've seen, I think, in the last 2 years is that firms have increased their prices as much when they were in a competitive market as they were in a non-competitive market. And if you think about the market for surgical face mask, I think that was a clear example. It's a very competitive market. Firms increased their prices because there was just more demand than there was supply. And so that's what's going on. Now, why is the supply larger than the demand? Is it, the demand larger than the supply? Is it because demand factors or supply factors, and both have been going on at the same time, as Luigi was pointing out. Now, market power is something different because in a sense, a firm can exert market power because somehow they can restrict entry. They can restrict the entry of competitors. And so that's not necessarily an issue of supply being larger than, again, demand being larger than supply. I mean, so many of these firms with market power, they can actually produce much more. It's just that they manage for some reason to restrict the amount that's being produced because that's beneficial to them because they can charge higher prices and therefore create higher profits. In terms of these kind of corporate greed, of course, clearly corporate greed is bad when it's price gouging, in the sense that if on 9/11 someone sells a bottle of water for $50 in downtown Manhattan, everyone will agree that this is some form of corporate greed. I mean, this is price gouging. The question is, in the case of the surgical face mask, was it corporate greed that the price jumped to $150 per mask? Maybe it was a good thing. I know of some person here in Europe who's in the business but didn't make surgical face masks. He sells stuff to hospitals, and then he sees this price jump. He invests immediately in machines, invests 900,000 euros. It's very expensive at a time because the machines are, of course, in high demand, and he has to ship it by air. Air is very expensive at that time in March 2020. Turns out that he's operating within a month, selling face masks at $1.50. Now, by July, the price of a face mask is back to 5 cents. And so maybe this wasn't so bad after all that these prices jumped, because this created a huge incentive for firms to enter and to basically expand that supply. So I don't think there's going to be any government who would have been able to plan and say, let's make sure that there's now more supply of these surgical masks. It was really the price incentives and the profit that these firms were making that did it. Of course, anyone who had made the investment before had a windfall profit. They weren't, expecting this, and so they had and so we see these jumps in the profit. But it's a bit like a Schumpeterian creative destruction kind of argument, that you get some gain that provides incentives for entering into this market. So what are the effects? Yes, indeed. So basically, with Jan de Lukker, we've looked over since the pandemic at what happens to this market. The same thing that this Roosevelt Institute paper does. One of the reasons we haven't written about it is because there's in the short run, there's an issue with data availability, and that spike actually in 2021 might come from the fact that the data was not available. So Compustat, they're using Compustat data, is actually quite slow in updating the data, and you have a big selection in the most recent data. And the reason why Jan and I didn't write it up is because we can't really say anything short run, because we really want to be sure that we have the data. We'd be able to say something about 2021 now, but not about 2020, for example. Okay, and but in any event, we do see that profits have been rising just after the pandemic. Basically, what firms did is in March, they of course had a drop in their markets and profits. The first thing they did was they basically laid off people and reduced their inputs. And what happened is that with the sales drop, they actually immediately recovered their profit rate from before. In fact, many of them managed to increase it in the short run. And by July, most of the firms were back to their initial markets as before. So this is, I think something's going on. Of course, we don't know whether these markets or these profits are up because of these, again, supply restrictions in the sense, or demand, excess demand that happen also in competitive markets. Okay, profits, there's as much corporate greed in markets with market power as there is in markets that are competitive. The second fact that we see about the firms is that, or at least in the aggregate, is that price inflation is higher than wage inflation. So wages are not catching up. I want to make one digression here. I think we should make a distinction between all other goods and natural resources, because natural resources, especially anything to do with energy, not just oil, but also kind of electricity provision. Of course, this is a very different product, a different good. This is a good that's typically inelastically supplied. And so basically, I mean, you just have to look at what happened in Russia. This was given as a present, I mean, through, of course, quite brinkmanship of the oligarchs, but they were basically given these resources. And it's not that it was their ability to particularly exploit these well that they became rich. They just managed to get access to these resources. And if you have these inelastic supplied goods where any little investment really makes a big difference, then of course you're going to get these huge swings in windfall profits. And on top of it, you have gaming of the system of many of these energy providers in these highly regulated markets because they're natural monopolies. And so you get these price swings when there's a huge change in the external circumstances like a war. And I think there we need a lot different ways of thinking about assigning basically the goods. Norway, I think, does a pretty good job there. They have designed a market or a mechanism to do this optimal extraction, even if you're the owner of the natural resources. So that's so much for the facts. Let me say something quickly about models. In a sense, in terms of the inflation, maybe the monetary transmission mechanism is now different than what we thought it was, in the sense that it's in the presence of these supply and demand distortions. So maybe some of these existing approaches are not the right one. I've seen some work by Furlaneto and co-authors and Fornaro and Romei have been looking at different ways of analyzing kind of the monetary transmission mechanism in the presence of these supply distortions. It seems to be important. Again, I'm not a specialist. I don't work with these models, and I'm sure that other people, Silvana, can say more about this. But I think it's also important to think, okay, what do these models that we have been using tell us, and how far can we go there? In terms of the models in IO, one important thing that I think we should also take into account, especially which is related to linking inflation to markets or to market power, is the idea of incomplete pass-through. Because there's incomplete pass-through, any shock is with more market power passed on to a lesser extent, if you want, and so that should give you actually less inflation responses to supply shocks. Now, of course, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on. I mean, our IO models would predict that if you have higher profits, you should see more entry. But of course, if investors think that this inflation is short-lived, and you think about IO kind of models where there's huge upfront investments of entering into a market, then they probably say, well, I see these high profits, but this is going to be very short-lived. Why would I make this huge investment to then be later in a market where there's actually not such a huge profit to be made? Because then inflation is going to be it's going to be down again, and then all these profits are going to have gone down as well. So you know, I think this is where macro meets micro, but again, where we have these two different time dimensions that are important. In addition to the temporary nature of the profits potentially and inflation, if that's the case, of course, there's more uncertainty now. There's a higher likelihood that we're going to have a recession, and in fact, the central banks are contributing to that. That again reduces the incentives to invest. So on the IO side, we see firms that, you know, oh, there's enormous profits, but enormous uncertainty at the same time. So they have much less incentives for that reason to invest. And I think that might explain why, despite these huge profits, we don't see the necessary entry to bring down these profits. One last remark on models. You know, there's a third reason in addition to supply distortions and demand distortion, which is basically the labor market that is you know, increased demands by workers for higher wages that pushes up inflation. And I think there's a huge question mark for me there, because we don't fully understand it even in competitive markets. So basically what we know is that job searchers towards the end of the boom tend to search more actively, more to increase their wage rather than to get better jobs, and that's really inflationary pressure. Whereas in the beginning of the boom, they're in bad jobs, they just want to get better jobs and get higher wages like that. And so because there's this difference over the cycle, now the question is, how does that vary when there's market power? We know nothing. At least I know of no papers that have done any work on that. And I think to me, that's an open question, but you know, it seems to me that at this point that the labor market channel seems to be not the main one compared to the supply and the demand distortions. So the bottom line is that, you know, we have a lot of things going on at the same time. I would say supply and demand distortions mainly. But at the moment, I see market power and the inflation pressure as two fairly orthogonal mechanisms that are going on that seem to generate similar outcomes, higher profits and higher prices. But they're orthogonal for different reasons: the speed, the magnitude, you know, levels and ratios. And so at the moment, I find it hard to believe that market power is going to be causing a 9% inflation that we see, whereas we see, you know, typically on average 1% increase in the markets. And so I think, you know, I probably raised more questions that I've answered, but at the moment, I'm coming down on these two orthogonal mechanisms not being directly being able to explain the whole rising inflation.
Thank you, Jan. Very interesting. So your views are quite clear. I would just comment that it was an interesting conversation going on in the chat in the meantime on pass-through, and the answer is it depends whether demand is log concave or log convex. And to me, this is one of those instances where I see a disconnect between academia and policy. I mean, this is very different from the message that Andrea was actually telling us. Indeed, this is the right answer in the context of a very specific model, but then I really am interested to know whether, you know, enforcers have ever estimated a log linear demand or a log convex demand system, and whether this has ever had any traction with the policymaker. And my personal answer is no, which means that perhaps, yes, let's do that kind of research and publish it in our papers and in our universe. But if you're interested in policy, this doesn't lend itself to any policy conclusion. It's not actionable. Therefore, maybe we should change our models, make them simpler in some respects, but also more meaningful in other respects. But having said that, I know nothing about, you know, monetary policies. Now I would like to move to Basile. Basile, I think, is doing very interesting, exciting research, because Basile is exactly trying to put together industrial organization and the macro approach, so looking at the value chain using input-output tables and putting oligopolistic interaction there. So he's really trying to do that. So so this is really the frontier. It's tough, but I really would like. That's why we invited you, because we think you're doing something very valuable. Basile.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. I hope everyone can hear me well. Can I share some slides that I've prepared for this event?
Sure.
So let me just use the time that I'm sharing the slide to thank Tommaso for his for putting this event together, which is very much a hot topic and something that we kind of think as being very important. So I hope you guys can see my slide. So I'm a macroeconomist, and therefore I'm a bit simple. And then let me give you a simple view of the link between inflation and corporate greed. First, inflation is linked to the growth rate of price, and then we tend to believe that price is usually equal to a markup, which is kind of the margin that firms are charging over the nominal marginal cost, right? And then the same simple accounting kind of equation, rightening growth rate, really gives you a link between inflation here and the growth rate of this markup and potentially the growth rate of the nominal marginal cost. So I think Silvana told us something like that. Potentially, if the growth rate of those markup is high, then that should translate into an increase in price and therefore increase inflation. So potentially there is some sort of simple mechanism that we kind of all have in our unconsciousness of remembering from a first year macro class, that maybe a link between this growth in markup could lead to inflation. I think that's kind of where you could see a link between inflation and growth. However, when we go into the data, thanks to the work by Jan and his co-author, we've made huge progress in how to measure those margins. Now we have kind of reliable measure at the firm level of those markup. And then once you aggregate those markup, depending on the way you aggregate them, you get that the average growth rate for those two time series are between 0.2 and 0.3%. Just by simple, taking those simple equations I just showed you and trying to do some sort of back of the envelope calculation, you see that the growth rate of those markup is of the order of 0.2 or 0.3%, while the growth rate of inflation over the same period is something like 3.2%. So the growth rate of markup, so kind of a measure of corporate greed, is an order of magnitude smaller than the growth rate of prices, than inflation. So that's kind of why we're all very skeptical about the potential role of corporate greed as a phenomena that will lead to a big spike in inflation today. And especially there's more of a conceptual argument, which I think Jan kind of described very well, which is that these markups tend to be determined by many things, and especially change in technology, the difference between fixed or variable cost, the change in market structure, the role of entry, of competition, and also by antitrust enforcement. And we tend to believe that kind of all those factors are slow moving, in a sense they are not moving at the business cycle frequency at which we tend to study inflation, right? So overall, together with this kind of back of the envelope calculation, where it seems that an order of magnitude is different between the growth in corporate greed and the growth in inflation, together with kind of this conceptual framework that the deep determinant of markup and market power tend to be slow moving compared to change in inflation. However, that doesn't mean that some sort of imperfect competition or corporate greed doesn't have any role to play in the current period we're living now, especially because as Luigi was pointing out, a big part of this rise in inflation, both in Europe and in the United States, is I think thought to be supply driven, like supply chain disruption problem. But essentially, the key mechanism that market power deliver is something called incomplete pass-through, and I think that has been mentioned in the chat also. So, what is a pass-through? Just so everyone is on the same page. Pass-through, at least in this set of slides, is think about how much price change following a 1% increase in the cost, right? And empirical evidence on those pass-through tend to show that large firms that tend to have a high market power tend to have a pass-through about half of those of firms that face more competitive, that charge a lower markup and face a more competitive environment. That's kind of people in international trade literature and international macro have tried to estimate those numbers. And that kind of makes sense because, following a negative inflationary supply shock like we can of living today, those high markup firms, they can reduce their markup before increasing their price, right? So they can use the slack of their markup, of their margin, to not pass on the total increase in their cost to the price. So in that sense, corporate greed or market power of firm can help to mitigate the effect of supply-driven negative supply shock, right? And this type of mechanism, especially this heterogeneity of pass-through, it tends to be absent from textbook macro model. Right? And despite the fact that there is some evidence, recent evidence on this role of incomplete pass-through, among large markup firms versus low markup firms. So for instance, there is this very recent paper by economists from the ECB that have classified sector in high markup and low markup sector and have compute inflation rate for those two type of goods, right? I mean, there is many caveat to those work, but at least it's kind of indicative that, as you can see on this graph, where the inflation rate of high markup sector is drawn with a dashed line, you can see that the dashed line is much less volatile than the solid line, which is the inflation rate for low markup sector. So it seems that this kind of incomplete pass-through seems to be consistent, at least in this piece of evidence. Those guys are well-trained macroeconomists, and therefore they have used some macroeconometrics technique. They namely run a VAR to see the response of a low markup inflation rate versus high markup inflation rate in response to a series of shocks, how supply shock, global demand shock, or monetary policy shock. And they also have found that sectors where markup tend to be low tend to deliver a higher inflation than a sector where markup tend to be high. Right? So in that sense, it seems that there is some support, some empirical evidence to show that maybe the differential response of the role of market structure of industrial organization in transmitting those kind of supply-driven negative shock into prices. Right? And that's kind of what we would like to do. We would like to put more IO in macro by introducing those type of mechanisms. Right? The ideal model should include this very well thought incomplete pass-through theory that our IO economist colleague kind of have thought for years, together with a monetary macro model to study how that interact with inflation. Right? So there is some recent work based on that, Simon Mongi, Oliver Wang, and Ivan Werning, but there is another kind of so this first strand of work tried to see how imperfect competition interact with nominal friction. They have found that money is more non-neutral when you have strategic complementarities in pricing through oligopolistic competition. And there is also a potential new channel of the transmission of monetary policy that, by affecting the distribution of markup, monetary policy could actually affect productivity, or at least measure aggregate productivity. But overall, it seems that there is kind of a missing block here, which is we would like to have more macro research to study between the role of the interaction between inflation, imperfect competition, and antitrust policy. As Tommaso was saying, if you get back to my first equation, which is price is equal to markup over marginal cost, by enforcing some regulation, antitrust decrease the markup and create a one-off decrease in prices. Although there is a difference in temporality, in a sense, it takes years or months for the competition authority to reach a decision that might, which is not at the right frequency to respond to an increase in energy price like we see today. Right? So I think that would be my view here.
Thank you, Basile. Actually, I have a question. Is there research on what I call how prices transmit within the value chain according to how concentrated the value chain is? So take electricity prices. Electricity prices may increase for various reasons. One reason is that because the underlying cost is going up, or because there is a demand shock and therefore prices are increasing through a completely different mechanism. So, is there anybody trying to do this, value chain and how concentrated each element in the value chain is to explain how prices transmit across.
So thank you, Tommaso, to extend to it's really kind of like the next level I should have put here, which is this incomplete pass-through will depend different sector or at different place on the value chain. And for instance, the energy sector is something that is very much upstream. It's a sector that supply to all the sector and that take time between the energy produced at the central and the goods you receive on your desk. It takes time to propagate. And then the incomplete pass-through along this supply chain is definitely a determinant on how fast an increase in energy price lead to an increase in final good price, the final good that consumer face. So there is definitely very important work to be done on that. There is not much yet, some work. We still have struggling to understand where the supply chain disruption come from. Is there something beyond the simple supply shock, like some region in China that is under lockdown and therefore not producing any good, and or between that and the shortage of semiconductor. We're still trying to struggling to understand exactly how that lead to increase in price and to which extent the pass-through of those various sectors along the supply chain matters, and to be able to give you a quantitative answer, I think that's still research that needs to be done.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's very useful. Thank you, Basile. Next, I will have Jose. Jose Azar also has devoted lots of thoughts to this question. Jose, I think you also have a couple of slides you wanted to share. You're muted.
Yeah, can I share them?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's see. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
I've just made you co-host. You should be able to do it now.
Yes. So inflation and market power. It's been a pretty heated discussion in policy on Twitter and in many places. And it's very interesting because it's very hard, for IO economists to think about macro issues and vice versa. So how do I think about this? And I try to think about it, but it's not easy. So what are the ways in which market power could affect inflation? I mean, one is it could affect it directly by increasing markups, with all the caveats which is that anything that you say about let's say you have something like a markup shock, right? So the markup goes up. Does that lead to inflation? Not necessarily, right? Because anything that you say has to be mediated by some monetary policy response function, right? By some monetary policy rule. But then it could also affect it indirectly, because it could affect pass-through of monetary and demand and supply shocks, right? Aggregate demand and aggregate supply shocks. And this is where the initial discussion started. I started thinking about this because I think Hal Singer tagged me on Twitter when he did this graph of concentration from CompuStat and inflation, and he was claiming that the places that the industries where concentration was higher led to experience higher inflation during the period since COVID started. And I looked at this and I didn't agree, so I started discussing with him in a friendly way and saying I really didn't see that pan out in the data. And then more recently, there's been talk about asymmetric pass-through, the rockets and feathers theory and empirics, which means there could be more pass-through in response to an increasing cost than to a decreasing cost, right? So prices could rise like rockets and drop like feathers is the idea. This is Krugman brought this up last week in an op-ed he wrote. So, and this could keep retail prices downstream temporarily higher, right, and increase inflation. So the discussion started with claims that market power had increased pass-through by Hal Singer and the Boston Fed paper, Browning, Filat, and Joachim. It has that it's some distributed lag regressions, so, also with the CompuStat concentration, which many people have criticized. It has now moved to whether markups have directly increased so much in 2021 that could lead to an increase in the price level. again, not a permanent increase in inflation rates, but a jump in the price level, which is what we may be seeing now. I mean, we have that would also be experienced as inflation. So there's the paper by Kongsal and Luciani that came out a few weeks ago. I'm skeptical of that, but I'm open, to be convinced by evidence. And also, well, there's a discussion started by Krugman last week about rockets and feathers theory and evidence. And the paper that started this, I think, was Borenstein, Cameron, and Gilbert in 1997 that looked at asymmetric pass-through from oil prices to gasoline prices, right? Not gas prices, what we would call petrol prices in Europe. So the open question, I think, is when you put all of this together, is market power quantitatively important to explain current inflation? And I mean, I'm very skeptical of that. I mean, I think that who thought I would be sympathetic to this, because I think market power is very important, and we should study it. But doesn't mean that necessarily I think it plays a big role in the recent inflation. Why? My prior, essentially, but that doesn't mean market power in principle can have no effect. Obviously, market power affects prices, but I just think at the macro level, it's very hard to. My prior would be it's not really behind the current inflation. I mean, in part, this may be in this prior. I mean, just for disclosure. Well, first of all, I should disclose I have no consulting cases or anything to disclose. I should also disclose I'm from Argentina. The inflation rate in Argentina is currently 60%. The government, one of their main policies to combat inflation is price ceilings, and they sometimes claim that inflation is due to corporate greed. I mean, I think that's very hard to believe, So I think that we're seeing a similar kind of political dynamic at a much less spectacular dimension, right? But what happened? I mean, the world economy was hit by a catastrophe that was COVID, and governments responded by increasing the deficit and spending money, which was necessary, and some of these deficits were monetized. So the year-on-year rate of change, I mean, there was a big pulse of monetary growth in the US during the COVID recession, in which money growth was more than 25% year on year, right? So to me, if anything, the thing that's a bit needs an explanation is why isn't inflation even higher than the 9% that we're seeing now? Because money growth was 25%. I mean, the proximate answer is velocity of money went down. And again, monetarism is a little bit outdated, but still, I mean, you would expect that when there's such a big increase in the rate of growth of money, that would lead to an increase in prices in the economy. I mean, that money growth has now gone down, and monetary policy is tightening. So I wouldn't expect this to be permanent, but it could last for a while, because the money supply in the US, M2 money supply, is about 40%, more than 40% higher than it was pre-COVID. Prices haven't increased nearly as much, so I think that there could be room for more expansion in prices just from this temporary shock that eventually will go away as it's absorbed fully. Now, I'm not really an expert that can tell you exactly how much more prices will increase and whether velocity of money will come fully back to where it was. But anyway, I think this is something to look at. Also, in addition to this monetary expansion, we saw an increase in oil prices. First, the oil price crashed, and it went even negative in the US in April of 2020. But then since then, it has been increasing more or less steadily. I mean, there was a big spike right before the start of the war, but I don't really see a big break in the trend around the war. So this makes me a little bit skeptical that the oil price increase is mostly due to the war. If anything, it's maybe something that is used to deflect attention from other things like the monetary expansion. So okay, Hasinger had done a graph like this, but with concentration from Computer on the x-axis. I redid this graph by using markups from the Locker, Eckhout, and Unger. I mean, in 2019 Q4 that I calculated using their elasticity, their latest elasticity, and then the most updated Computer data. And I see that where there was more market power, where there was more market power, prices increased less. Right, so this made me skeptical of these claims that were being made that market power had a big role to play in inflation. I also ran some panel vector regressions using PPI data at the 4 digits level. And what we see here is an interacted panel VAR. So just a simple model that summarizes the joint dynamics of prices, oil prices, and Nakamura's times on monetary shocks. And we see much more pass-through from monetary shocks to prices in low market power markets than in high market power markets, right? Where the increase in prices in response to the same shock is much lower. And also, in response to oil shocks, the pass-through is much lower in more concentrated markets. I think this speaks to, and this whole discussion about theory, you know, it's a little bit nerdy, you know, when we say log concavity versus log convexity, and I think so. But the way I interpret that nerdy discussion is this tells us it's an empirical question. I think that the empirics suggest that in higher market power industries, pass-through is lower. So an increase in market power over time, if anything, it would make the pass-through of the oil shocks and the monetary shocks to inflation less. This lower pass-through is also consistent with the models that people mentioned of Mongi 2021 and Werning 2020. At the same time, in this same VAR, I mean, just as an aside, we do see that monetary shocks, these are expansionary monetary shocks. I put a minus sign. If anything, monetary shocks are an increase in interest rate. These are a reduction in the interest rate. So it's a monetary expansion has a very large effect on the oil price. So in terms of pass-through, it doesn't seem that pass-through is helping us say, well, market power is causing inflation. On the other hand, Mike Kongsal and Luciani came up with this paper a couple of weeks ago showing that there's this big spike in 2021 in the Locker and Eckhout markup. I'm pretty skeptical of this because of the following. I mean, there was a big spike in the Locker and Eckhout's markup in 2016, which was the last year of their data in their version. Now that the data is updated, that spike has basically gone away, at least by half. And the spike has gone to the last year. So I think there may be some data issues there, and we need to look into that. At the same time, all the caveats that people mentioned apply. I mean, just because the markup went up doesn't mean that there's going to be inflation. It depends on the monetary policy rule. So, and in particular, there has been this very large increase in markups, although I guess Basile says year on year is not that large. But we haven't really seen a very high inflation period. Okay, this may be related to how inventories are accounted for and things like that. Chris Conlon has said some things to this effect on Twitter. And then today I looked at these rockets and feathers regressions, and I do see some evidence of asymmetric pass-through, although it seems to come not from a very big jump here, as was seen in the Borenstein regressions. It's like when I add this pre-period, so I add these forwards to the distributed lag model, I do exactly the same regression as them. I add forwards to see a pre-trend. There seems to be this anticipation, so this pre-trend in the positive price increases, and so we see this asymmetric. But if I exclude the COVID period, if I just run from 1990 to 2019, and I stop in 2020, they look almost the same. I mean, almost identical. So I'm also a little bit skeptical of the rockets and feathers story for empirical reasons.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much. So skepticism, but now we have Thomas Philippon. We rely on you, Thomas, to give us the final truth.
That's tall order. Well, first of all, thank you very much. So since I'm last, let me just try to summarize a little bit why there is so much confusion and today. So I think it's important to keep in mind the background first. So we come to 2019 and we have a long history of research in macro and IO. But it's kind of focused on slightly different questions, and also it tends to push in a direction which is the opposite of what we see today. So typically, the first thing is there's been a lot of work on the pass-through issue. So the pass-through that we've looked at a lot is 1% increase in marginal cost. What does it do to the price? And now, as we discussed also on the model you write on, obviously. So that's why it's important to have some empirical evidence. The evidence we have, and consistent with what we just saw in the previous two presentations, is that typically the pass-through is lower when firms have more market power, because that's the classic result. Now, it's also important to understand that over the past 20 years, we've worked very hard to reduce the volatility of inflation in our models. Because remember that in 2010, we were writing papers about the missing disinflation, right? So the puzzle was like inflation should have been much lower, it did not. Okay, so that pushed us towards writing models where really the price setting of firms is not very sensitive to marginal cost, which is why inflation doesn't move that much, either up or down. And that was like by far the main focus of the literature. It was also true after the 2009-2010, because we had big changes in oil prices also. I mean, oil price today, if you look at Europe, they're the same as today, they're the same as they were in around 2014. But if you look at the 2010-2014, oil prices went up by like just as much as they did recently, and inflation didn't move. So all of these models were geared toward explaining why you could have big swings in marginal cost or even energy prices and no big swing in inflation. Inflation was very stable in these models. And you get that by having pass-through that are stable and also tend to be a bit lower when firms have market power. So that's one thing. The second thing is what happens how does the economy change if market power goes up, right? So now it's not in response to shock, it's just the impact of market power. And there, so in the paper with Jones and Gutierrez, we look at how does the economy respond, what happens to inflation if you have an increase in entry costs, for instance. Well, it turns out that inflation doesn't move. Now that's surprising because you'd think, well, the one equation in the model is going to have the markup. If the market goes up, prices should go up. And if you add staggered Calvo style price setting, you're going to get inflation. It's going to take a bit of time for the price level to go up. Well, that's true, but the thing is, if you increase entry costs and you decrease competition, you have a negative impact on aggregate demand because typically employment and investment are going to go down. It turns out they just exactly cancel each other. So that explains why you could have a period of rising market power and markups since the late 90s or early 2000, and yet inflation barely registering anything. So that's where we started. Okay, that's how we arrived at the thing. And now, given these models, it's pretty clear that the safe conclusion is the one we already heard, which is it's very unlikely that market power would explain the current inflation for two reasons. First, there was no obvious change in market power over the past 2 years. Second, the pass-through effect doesn't really go in the direction you want, which typically more market power lowers the pass-through, does not increase it. Okay, so that's kind of what we had from the past. So the safe conclusion then is to say simply that, look, the current inflation is really not due to market power, either a change in market power or existing market power interacting with current shocks. So that's not a place where we should direct policy. Of course, I mean, what I've argued is that I think that's the plausible argument. On the other hand, there's still the opportunity cost argument. And just like structural reform in the labor market, which you want to do when unemployment is low, now is a good time to do antitrust policy. It's not that it's not that market power is the cause of inflation, but if for whatever reason inflation is high, now is a good time to tighten antitrust requirements or other regulations that may increase competition. Now, that these policies may not be very optimal if you're in a deflation. You could debate that. There is lots of research on that, especially on the 1930s. But then there's the opportunity argument. So I think the safe conclusion that most economists have reached is like, well, okay, market power is not the cause of inflation, but on the other hand, it's a good time to do antitrust. You might want to do it for other reasons. And as a side effect, you might have a small negative impact on inflation, which is good. Okay, so I think that's kind of the safe conclusion. Now, I want to challenge that a little bit in the sense that I don't know the true answer, but I think there is a lot of uncertainty behind that. So the first thing to notice is that all the big inflations, typically, they're always some mixture of perfect storms. There is always more than one thing going on. So today, if we didn't have at the same time a very large stimulus package in the US, which itself is a consequence of what happened in 2008, where the fiscal response was too small, policymakers concluded, well, we won't do that again. Next time it's going to be at least as big as it needs to be. Then they ended up making it too big. That's been well discussed in the literature. Like the last round of stimulus in the US was probably twice what it should have been, given the size of the output gap. Well, that came from the history of the 2009 failed response. Now you add to that the impact of the COVID disruption on supply chains and on the labor market. Maybe these two things together would not have been enough to create that much inflation, but then you add the war in Ukraine. Okay. But my point here is that it's rarely the case that one thing is driving everything. And when you have big bouts of inflation, it's usually the perfect storm kind of thing, which is many things going on at the same time. And that's what we saw in the 70s. I think that's part of what we saw today, which is why you end up today with the one thing that's for sure is that we are near a period of maximum uncertainty and confusion in the macro data. If you look at the macro data, jobs and GDP growth tell you different things. Wages and prices tell you different things. And even like consumer confidence and spending also tell you different. So there is definitely a case for the fact that the economy today is very uncertain and very confusing to analyze. So in this context, I think that we should be more open to other sources of changes in price setting. And I just want to mention one, which I think is probably potentially just as important as the one we've discussed so far. So in macro, the pass-through, when we said the pass-through as macroeconomists on the panel, every time we said that, what we meant is the pass-through from the marginal cost to the price setting today. But there is another pass-through which is critical in the new Keynesian model, is the pass-through from expected inflation to current inflation. And it turned out that one is actually, it depends a lot on the IO structure, but it also depends just as much on the price setting structure. And I just saw a recent paper by Ivan Verning showing that pass-through from expected inflation to current inflation can vary a lot depending on the details of the models and the price setting. Could be close to zero, it could be much more than one. Okay. Now, that's a part where we don't understand very well. And I would argue that in today's environment, it's probably a big one, which is, I'm pretty sure that many firms setting their prices today are thinking about what they are expected inflation and the expected inflation of their competitors. And this is not the kind of things we looked at over the past 20 years. This is not the usual pass-through calculation. And on that one, there is a lot of scope for new research and potentially there a role for market power. It's just, we don't know. But I think that in terms of pass-through, the current, at least in my mind, the current focus should be at least in part on this inflation expectation pass-through and how it differs across markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Also very good. I really enjoy your safe answer and then the more challenging one that relies on new Keynesian models, etc. That's very good. So, guys, we have very nice to see this dialogue happening between researchers from different fields with a common passion, which is policy and markets, and that's I think a very good outcome of this afternoon's conversation. So I want to thank the CEPR for organizing this, for hosting us. It's been a very nice conversation.